I'm Jen Finelli. You may not know that I'm also a sexual assault medical forensic examiner, as well as a licensed physician. You're here to think about how you can help your friend who's undergoing or struggling with recovering from a sexual assault. So there's a couple things that you need to understand first about the biology of sexual assault that I think a lot of people don't get when they think about how to best help their friend. We've been taught, a lot of us, that there is a fight or flight response. The reality is there are 3 physiological responses that occur during an intense adrenaline surge. They're fight, flight, and freeze. I can see you nodding and realizing that changes everything about the way we think about sexual assault and guilt. Understanding that somebody may not have been able to move, say no, or even scream because they were so terrified that they were paralyzed. I don't know if you've ever experienced sleep paralysis, but if you have, that's a very, very good comparison. Just the horror and terror of having no control over your body and being unable to move. And that permanently affects the hippocampus, which is the memory section of the brain, as well as the amygdala, which is the section for arousal and pleasure. So it's important to understand that a sexual assault is not just a physical assault, but in a lot of ways it is like a brain injury that has been inflicted biologically on the person. And that's to say nothing of the fact that a sexual assault may involve strangling or a physical and external traumatic brain injury, both of which can affect things like cognition and even some personality in the frontal cortex. So a sexual assault is not just unwanted sex, but is actually an injury to the human brain. And it's important to understand that as you're taking care of your friend, trying to be a friend to someone who has undergone this, and also with understanding yourself if you've undergone this as well. Understand and realize that a lot of the changes you're going through and a lot of the things you're experiencing, they're not your fault. They're something that's happening to you, and they're an injury. And when you think about it a little bit more medically like that, I think it takes away a lot of the, already we've debunked, just with that medical explanation, a lot of the myths that people have surrounding sexual assault. Understanding even the physiological responses, it is possible for both male and female rape victims, and I'm saying victim in this case because this is before you become a survivor, right? There's a transition from victimization to survivorhood and then being able to help other people. So when I'm using the word victim, I'm not trying to take power away from you. I'm trying to talk about, and I think it's important to emphasize the transition, especially from the first 48 hours into long-term survivorhood and then eventually advocacy and heroism for other people. This is, I think, an especially important distinction because statistically, rape victims and rape survivors are more likely to be re-traumatized or what we call re-victimized. So being able to escape the mental cycle of punishment and guilt that can be associated with that, especially if somebody has had multiple different rape experiences, I think is very important to understand that transition from victimhood into survivorhood. It is not the person's responsibility. Somebody is not responsible for healing, for forgiveness, for anything that happened. This is something that happened to them. Healing is something that happens gradually, and you can't guilt or push that or any other emotional healing on the victim. You have to understand that time matters, and that unfortunately many both organized and disorganized sex offenders tend to have a type. So somebody who's re-victimized, it's not their fault. It's because sociologically that is the type that the twisted mind of the attacker has focused on. So that attacker is more likely to, it's similar to pedophilia. There are a lot of preferential pedophiles who will tend to go after a certain age and look of child, and rapists are similar. Rapists have a type because they're objectifying the person, whether male or female. They're looking at the person as a means to an end, not as a full person, and I think that's also important for you to understand while you're trying to provide support and care for somebody, especially if you find out that that person has been re-victimized multiple times. Being very, very careful not to use language that that is punitive. For example, there is a right and a wrong way to invite someone to a self-defense class, and there's a right and a wrong time. It can be very, very painful if you tell a rape victim that they need to come take a self-defense class so that they know how to fight back next time. That you can see how that kind of makes it their fault. And it fails to understand the basic human physiology that makes it so they can't. It's not that they made a decision in the moment, it's that they physically did not have the capability to do anything. On the other hand, right, we do have significant statistical evidence because 81% of rapists, according to some older FBI analysis, 81% of rapists tend to be power reassurance rapists. This tends to be people who consider themselves losers, and they see themselves as doing a favor or being in a romantic relationship with the person they are attacking. The person that they are harming, right? Those rapists, that 81% of rapists, tend to be much more easily dissuaded compared to other types of rapists with things like striking. So yes, striking and self-defense are useful, and you want to strike that balance between there's nothing you could have done and there's nothing you can ever do. Understanding that in the past there's nothing you could have done, understanding in the future it's not your fault. Let's try to find ways to fight back against these bastards and make sure it doesn't happen again, and empower the victim. So again, a self-defense should be approached from the perspective not of shame, guilt, or responsibility, but from the perspective of empowering the person so that they don't have to live in fear. My patients during the first 48 hours, I found this was a universal. Every patient I took care of who had, within the first 48 hours of their assault, whether I did their forensic exam or I was their sexual assault care provider, every single one of them had a really strong fear response in the first 48 hours. And this includes victims and survivors who didn't have a traditionally violent rape, people who were significantly sedated with alcohol, and that's how they were taken advantage of, people who somebody broke into their room. They, especially those folks, had a lot of trouble sleeping the first 48 hours and couldn't even turn off the light because they were in so much terror. And this is all of them, regardless of where it occurred, the first 48 hours they had so much trouble sleeping and so much trouble even turning on the light. So being able to give the person back their power is very important, but you may not be, as a friend, the right person to do that, because the victim, your friend, is likely to feel ashamed and shy even having mentioned it to you. They don't want to, especially a male victim, doesn't want to look bad in front of you. So because you have a relationship with them, you're not a therapist, you're not a doctor, they want to keep up appearances even as they're confiding in you. So suggestions that you make are going to be much more painful and much more likely to be taken as shame or guilt. Obviously, it depends on the person, but especially with like a male survivor, one of the best things that I saw, male brought in his friend who was a male survivor. While I was making sure that his psychological and physical needs were met, his buddy said to him, "This has nothing to do with your manhood. You gotta know the other guy is a coward. The other guy is not a man." Re-emphasizing and reaffirming the patient's masculinity as a friend. Now that's something that a therapist and a doctor doesn't have as much power to do. So there are places where you have more power than a therapist or a doctor, because that peer pressure, for lack of a better word, makes what you say so valid. If you can reaffirm that the other person is a coward, the other person is weak, especially with male victims, the other person is a loser, right? Putting the shit, because there is shame and guilt involved in the situation, and transferring that shame and guilt in the victim's mind to the direction where it belongs, to the person who perpetrated the act. And depending on what you say, your reaffirmation of things that are important to the survivor's identity, for a male victim, his masculinity. For many women, it's important that they not feel like loose, they not feel like a slut. It has to do with their identity, right? And these are horrible words that may have been used by the attacker during the assault, right? A similar thing with masculinity, like the horrible thing about an assault, it's not about the sex. If you just want sex, you ask 100 different women for sex, and statistically it's been shown that at least one will say yes, right? It's not just about sex, it's about establishing power over someone else, right? And that core, it's not just not that brain injury, but brain injury reflects on what we are, right? And so all of that together creates a core identity injury to the survivor. So reaffirming their identity, things that are important about their identity to them, right? Depending on what is important to them. Power reassurance rapists will often use a woman's physiological response against her and say, for example, you know, oh, you're wet, you must enjoy it. I'm sorry, I know this is kind of graphic and difficult and rough, but that's the reality of what survivors have gone through and what survivors are going through. And so understanding that those words may repeat in their minds. I have made a habit of, when I did my exams or even my sexual assault care or even pelvic exams on people who haven't reported a sexual assault history, I try to avoid using the word relax, because that's something that somebody may have used. Relax or calm down. A lot of this group, the most common group of, people who assault other people, a lot of them use that kind of language as they're establishing power over the other person. So it's the same when someone's having a panic attack, which is something that can occur, right, in your friends who are survivors. It's important to understand that calm down is not a useful word. Relax is not a useful word. Refocusing them into something else, thinking about the positive parts of their identity. In a moment of crisis, distraction can be helpful. In a moment where it's not a moment of crisis, like physiological crisis, panic, but it's a moment of opening up and talking to you, the most powerful thing you can do is listen. Don't make a commentary. Listen. And every now and then, when you have the opportunity to say something, when it is your time to say something, when there's a long pause, and silence is okay, when there's a long pause, you say things that reaffirm the person's identity, right? Reaffirm who they are. Reaffirm the things that are most likely to have been damaged by this assault. And that's really the most powerful thing that you can look into. At some point, we're going to have Lucasha Sims Neal back on the channel, who is a child abuse survivor. I'm going to include a link to the written interview I did with her below. And she talks a lot about, like, people, how harmful it was that people would put onus on her to recover and forgive, move on, these kind of things, while nothing ever happened to the people who attacked her, right? And even as a provider, with the traumatization and re-traumatization of seeing these cases over and over again, even as someone who isn't in the survivor's shoes, I can tell you it is so infuriating and morally damaging to watch, 7 rapists get off scot-free because they're never ever going to be, no one's ever going to report because they're afraid, because of the power dynamic that's occurred. So you watch 7 rapists get off scot-free, and then you see people get in trouble publicly for, tiny little things that are nothing, like yelling at somebody, right? And I can tell you personally, as a care provider, that was incredibly traumatic for me, to say nothing of how horrible that is for the actual victim. So be very cognizant of justice, and the survivor's sense of justice, and how that sense of justice will often feel perverted or harmed. The other thing is, never play silver lining games with your friend who has experienced a sexual assault. Never say, at least you didn't experience this. At least this didn't happen. Never, ever do that. I think most of you are probably cognizant enough not to do that, but some people are not, and that is the worst. It again really minimizes the pain the person is experiencing and may even make them feel guilty for the pain that they're experiencing. And that's something that you need to not do. Guilt and shame are going to be a prominent feature of the person's life, again, because of physiological responses that may have occurred during the assault. Remember that the onus and burden is not on the assault victim to say no, but on the other person to ascertain a yes, right? And I say that because not because we don't have responsibility over our own actions. Everyone has personal responsibility. Everyone needs to learn assertiveness communication to communicate whether they do or don't want sexual intercourse. But unconscious people can't communicate that. Frozen people can't communicate that. Right? People who are significantly drugged or under the influence of alcohol can't communicate that, right? So the onus is on the other person to ensure that the person they want to have intercourse with is in a safe state of mind that they can consent, right? And that's what it means. When we talk about consent, it doesn't mean that like we're trying to catch everyone and we want everyone to sign like sex contracts beforehand, although who knows. So we've talked a little bit about the emotional side of supporting your friend through a sexual trauma. Let's talk a little bit about some very quick practical things that you can do, depending on your build, depending on your appearance, and depending on some of your financial ability. So it may help, and one of the recommendations that I saw from a forensic nurse, from an experienced forensic nurse, was if you have a masculine voice, it may help for you to record the voice message machine, answering machine, for your female friends who live alone, who are more likely to be victimized. Additionally, lesbian or gay folks are more likely to be victimized. This was just anecdotal, just my experience, but 100% of the patients that I saw of a certain sexuality, I want to be careful because I also don't want to reveal anybody's secrets, but of one of those minority groups, 100% of my patients had been sexually victimized at one time or another by the opposite gender, or in some cases by the same gender, depending on whether they were lesbian or gay. My gay men were more likely to have been assaulted in the past by men, and my lesbian patients were also more likely to have been assaulted in the past by men. Why do I bring that up? Because if you're somebody that you care about has a voice that they're more likely to be victimized, it is not their fault. You may be able to help protect them if they ask, or if they live alone and they're shy and they're likely to be targeted, by recording their voicemail message for them, going with them to dangerous places, right? Like if they have to walk home at night, don't let them walk home alone. Especially right after the assault, people are very afraid. I mentioned for the first 48 hours, can't even sleep, okay? So very practical things that you can do, because a man with a very masculine voice can also be victimized, so that's not going to be useful in his case. In fact, in Austin, Texas, near the area where I practiced for a period of time, you would have a frequent situation where a masculine looking man, stereotypically masculine, a soldier usually, somebody like that, will go into a bar. A woman would drug his drink, and then she would sell him to a group of men to be assaulted. And a lot of this has to do with animosity towards masculine men. Other men who might feel inferior or might want to feel like they dominate them will feel stronger having assaulted a soldier or a very masculine man. That kind of history of oppressive assault goes all the way back to the time of the Vikings, when Viking males would sexually assault males that they had defeated. Right? It's a way of demonstrating power, warriorhood over the other person. It's primitive, it's disgusting, and it is a thing that still happens today. People who feel insecure in themselves, or who feel slighted by somebody's way that they are, like maybe they're slighted that this person is a soldier and they feel like that's a personal affront, they will target that person. So obviously I'm rambling a little bit, but in that kind of situation, you recording their voicemail message might not be helpful. Again, none of this is because it's their fault, but you can still stand in as a protector and supporter while maintaining that other person's individuality and agency. Again, I bring up male victims a lot because of my work with the military, but both male and female victims can also become offended if you're very much in their space. They can feel like you think that they're weak. So it's very important that you emphasize to them that you don't think they're weak. You want to support them, and a lot of times that support can be quiet. Another feature that is very important for you to think about is helping and supporting them to maintain, this is going to sound weird, a diet and exercise schedule. People will often feel worthless after an assault, and they won't feel like their bodies deserve to be taken care of. They'll be angry about their bodies. So inviting somebody to go exercise with you, inviting somebody to eat somewhere that's fairly healthy, or cooking for them, little things like that can be helpful in just maintaining the regularity of the situation. And I think it should also be mentioned that if you are in a situation where you know both the victim and the suspect, right, where you know both people, obviously keeping them apart is going to be important. Do not invite both people to the same situation, and I would, because you are not there, and especially if you know both people, because you were not there, I would encourage you to encourage the survivor to focus his or her attention on getting a forensic exam, and if possible reporting, and you don't need to show animosity to or attack the suspect, because again, you were not there, and in some cases that could endanger the other person more, right? Everything that you do is going to be dependent on your own situation, and what your survivor friend needs. In the military, 80 to 90% of people who file unrestricted sexual assault reports are then retaliated against, either physically or with their work, or with gossip, and so forth. People might share pictures of them that occurred during the assault. People might physically threaten them or their loved ones. I had one patient who was violently assaulted by the husband of a friend, and she was afraid to report because she was afraid for the life of her friend. So you have to understand also that you can't pressure somebody to file a report. And when I say the words unrestricted and restricted, what I'm talking about is specifically in the military, and it's similar in the civilian world, but in the military, when you file an unrestricted report, that means it's a legal investigation and they can now try to take down the suspect. A restricted report means that only medical personnel and sexual assault reporting personnel know about the situation, and it doesn't go to legal. And that's only so that, for two reasons: one, so that the patient can get the care that they need, and two, so you can gather forensic evidence and save it in case in the future somebody wants to make a report. There's also a new database now where you can file restricted and secretly, but the person's name goes into this secret database, and then if there's ever a second hit, that will be opened up, and that information can be used in an investigation. Not necessarily if there's a second hit, but if someone does file an unrestricted report, your information can then be used to get, to get justice and get the suspect. So there's many ways for the survivor to report. So you should always encourage the survivor to seek medical care and to get an exam. An exam can be very traumatizing and very stressful, so it may be helpful if you are there with them to hold their hand. If you're the opposite gender, it might not. If you're the same sex as the person who attacked them, ask them. Just ask them, do you want me to be in the room with you? I'm not going to be offended if you want me to be out of the room. I totally get it. Just let the survivor know that they can make choices, and you're not going to penalize them for those choices. Again, trying to affirm their identity and their autonomy. Okay, so for these more practical things here at the end, it may be helpful for you to help with their voicemail message. Don't leave them alone. Offer to go places with them. Help them diet and exercise. Invite them to come out of the house. People will often become isolated. And when it comes to reporting, help them to know that there are many options, and be willing to protect them. In most cases, you don't want to target, I never make absolute statements. In most cases, you don't want to target the other person if you know them. You want to push that towards legal, and I think it's important for you to consider, right, somebody who has committed an assault, depending on the level, like the FBI categorization, are more likely to assault again. Regardless of the situation, there are safety concerns, right? And so even somebody who seems non-threatening can be a threat to other people later. So this is something important to consider when you're walking with your friend through this situation. It's very difficult to find right or wrong answers in this kind of situation, because reporting helps to protect other people. Taking action helps to protect other people, but at the same time, you need to very carefully assess the risk if you take action, if you try to report, of how much that's going to harm the sexual assault victim themselves. Sexual assault cases are incredibly traumatizing to the person who reported. You get interrogated over and over again. You have to relive the assault over and over again, by people who are supposed to be on your side and people who are, defense attorneys. They're exactly the opposite of you. You will often be humiliated. You will be gossiped about. There will be a lot of he said, she said in your friend circle. So that's something that you need to discuss and work together with them on, right? Give them strength. See them as strong and let them feel strong.